The first time I stepped onto this land, my boot sank 6 inches into black mud before I could pull it back out. The whole property smelled like standing water and decay. My Cajun neighbor looked at me from across the fence, shook his head slowly, and said in the particular way that Louisiana people say things they mean completely. "Cher, that land ain't never gonna grow nothing but mosquitoes." 3 years later, that same man brings his grandchildren to see my farm, because he had never seen anything like it in Terrebonne Parish. Terrebonne Parish sits in the heart of Louisiana's coastal wetlands, a landscape so flat and so saturated with water that the boundaries between land and water have always been a matter of negotiation rather than fact. The parish name itself means good earth in French, which is either a beautiful irony or a very old promise, depending on how you look at it. My 20 acres sat at the edge of where the agricultural land of South Louisiana transitions into the marsh, that uncertain territory where the soil is technically above water, but has never fully committed to the idea. Previous owners had tried twice to make something of it. The first attempt, decades ago, had left behind the rotting remnants of drainage ditches that had long since clogged and ceased to function. The second attempt had left a collapsed equipment shed, a rusted irrigation pump half buried in the mud, and a soil profile so compacted and waterlogged that even the most aggressive weeds struggled to establish themselves. What grew there instead was what always grows in abandoned, wet Louisiana land: a dense tangle of common reed, giant cutgrass, and the particular combination of invasive species that thrive in disturbed wetland margins. Phragmites australis, the tall, feathery-topped invasive reed, had colonized the lowest sections completely, its roots forming an impenetrable mat that excluded almost everything else. Chinese tallow trees, one of the most aggressive invasive trees in the Gulf South, lined the northern boundary, their distinctive leaves already turning the pale yellow of early autumn when I first walked the property. The soil beneath all of this was what soil scientists call a vertisol, a heavy, shrink-swell clay that is sticky and nearly impassable when wet, cracks deeply when dry, and has a particular talent for heaving fence posts, buckling pavement, and generally resisting any human attempt to impose order on it. It was also, beneath its difficult surface behavior, extraordinarily mineral-rich. Louisiana vertisols have been depositing nutrients from Mississippi River floodwaters for thousands of years. The fertility was there. It was just locked inside a soil that was simultaneously too wet, too compacted, and too chemically imbalanced for most crops to access it. My neighbor, a man named Thibodaux, third-generation Terrebonne Parish, who had watched 2 previous owners fail on this exact property, leaned on the fence the first morning I was there and watched me walk the property in rubber boots that the mud was actively trying to steal from my feet. "What you fixin' to do with that?" he asked. I told him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Cher, I've been watching people try to farm that piece for 30 years. That land don't want to be farmed." "I think it just hasn't been asked the right way," I said. He laughed, not unkindly, just with the particular certainty of someone who has lived in one place long enough to know what that place will and won't do. "We'll see," he said. "Wetland requires a different kind of reading than dry land. You can't walk it the same way. Every step tells you something about what's happening below the surface, and if you're moving too fast, you miss the information." I spent the first week moving slowly, deliberately, learning the property through the soles of my rubber boots. The lowest section, the southwestern corner, was the most saturated. Standing water visible between the reed stems, even in a dry week. This section was not going to be farmed directly, not for years. But it was going to be shaped into something useful, a managed wetland area that would serve as the farm's water management heart, filtering runoff, providing habitat, and demonstrating that wetland doesn't have to be drained to be valuable. The northeastern section was higher, marginally but measurably. The difference was perhaps 18 inches of elevation across the property, but in flat Louisiana land, 18 inches is the difference between perpetually flooded and occasionally flooded. The northeastern corner had the best drainage, the darkest surface soil, and, most importantly, signs of historical cultivation. Old furrow lines, barely visible under the reed growth, told me that someone had once grown something here successfully. The soil remembered. The Chinese tallow trees along the northern boundary were a significant problem and a significant opportunity simultaneously. Their roots were stabilizing the northern edge of the property against erosion, useful. But their fallen leaves contained allelopathic compounds that suppressed the germination of other plants in the surrounding soil, a problem for any production area near them. They would have to be removed systematically, and their removal would take time and had to be done correctly to prevent the vigorous resprouting that makes tallow trees so difficult to eliminate. The old drainage ditches, clogged, collapsed, but still present, told me the story of what the previous owners had understood about the land's water management needs. They had been right about the need for drainage. They had been wrong, or underfunded, or both, about the execution. The ditch system was in the right locations. It just needed to be restored, deepened, and connected to a functional outlet. I mapped everything. The elevation variations measured with a simple water level, the drainage flow directions, the invasive species density in each zone, the location of the old furrow lines, the position of the collapsed shed and the rusted pump, both of which would be cleared but whose locations told me where the previous farmers had wanted their infrastructure to be, which was useful information. By the end of the first week, I had a map and a plan. The plan had 5 phases. Phase 1 was going to take most of the first year, and it had nothing to do with planting. Crops. Everything in Louisiana farming, when you are working with wetland, begins with water management. Not fighting the water, managing it. There is a profound difference. I hired a local excavator operator named Marcus, who had spent 20 years working drainage projects in Terrebonne Parish and understood the particular behavior of South Louisiana clay soils in a way that no textbook could teach. He walked the property with me for half a day before he touched a machine, reading the land. The same way I had, slowly through the boots. "You got good bones here," he said, which was the most encouraging thing anyone had said to me about this property. Previous ditches were right, just not deep enough and not connected right. We designed a system together. Marcus's practical knowledge of how water moved in this specific parish, combined with my understanding of what the farm needed to function. The main drainage ditch ran along the western boundary, deepened to 4 feet and lined, with compacted clay on the sides to prevent bank collapse. Secondary lateral ditches ran at intervals across the property, each one slightly higher than the main ditch to create a gravity flow system that would pull water off the surface and into the main outlet. The critical element, the piece that made the difference between a drainage system that worked and one that didn't, was the water control structure at the outlet. Not a simple drain, but an adjustable control gate that allowed me to set the water table level across the property deliberately. In wet periods, the gate could be opened to lower the water table and allow field operations. In dry periods, and Louisiana does have dry periods, often suddenly and severely, the gate could be partially closed to maintain soil moisture at the root zone without irrigation, managing water in rather than always managing it out. Marcus finished the excavation in 2 weeks. When the first rain came after the drainage system was complete, 3 inches in 6 hours, a standard Louisiana afternoon thunderstorm, I stood at the field edge and watched water move. Not pool, not stand, move. Through the lateral ditches, into the main ditch, through the control structure, out to the roadside drainage canal. The land was breathing. The phragmites and the Chinese tallow trees could not be left in place. Both were aggressive enough that any production area within their influence would be constantly fighting recolonization rather than growing food. The phragmites came out first, in the production zones. I used a combination of cutting and targeted herbicide application, the same cut, stump and foliar method I had researched carefully, approved for wetland-adjacent use. The phragmites' root mat, once the stems were treated, had to be physically removed where possible. It was so dense in the worst sections that it functioned like a woven mat just below the soil surface, preventing any new root penetration. That root mat removal was the hardest physical work of the entire project. I rented a walk-behind tractor with a rotary tiller attachment and made repeated passes through the treated phragmite zones, breaking up the root mat and exposing it to the surface where it would desiccate and decompose. Each pass required the tractor to fight through the dense fibrous roots. Each pass opened the soil a little more. The Chinese tallow trees along the northern boundary required a different approach. Cut stump treatment with a concentrated solution applied immediately after cutting to prevent resprouting. I hired 2 local workers for a week to work the tallow line systematically, one cutting, one treating, moving down the boundary together. The tallow stumps had to be monitored for the following 2 years and any resprouting treated immediately. With the tallow trees removed from the northern boundary, something unexpected happened. The soil along that edge, which had been suppressed by the allelopathic leaf and chemistry for years, began to respond almost immediately. Dormant native seed bank in the soil, freed from the chemical suppression, germinated within weeks. Not crops, native Louisiana grasses and wildflowers. But their appearance told me something important. The soil biology under those tallow trees had been waiting. It was still alive. The vertisol soil of South Louisiana, mineral-rich, fertility-dense, but structurally impossible in its native waterlogged state, was not going to become market garden soil through amendment alone. The shrink-swell behavior, the waterlogging, the surface compaction, these were structural problems that required a structural solution. I built raised beds, not the modest 6-inch timber frames of a backyard garden, but serious raised production beds, 12 inches of elevation above the surrounding field grade, constructed with treated cypress lumber that would resist the Louisiana humidity and soil contact for decades. Cypress is the traditional building material of the Louisiana wetlands for exactly this reason. It is extraordinarily rot-resistant, and in Terrebonne Parish it is available from local sawmills at reasonable cost. The beds were filled with a custom growing medium, composted sugarcane bagasse from a mill in the parish, a locally available high-carbon amendment that opens clay soil structure and adds organic matter simultaneously. River sand from a local supplier to improve drainage. Aged manure from a cattle operation 20 miles north. And the native vertisol itself, screened through hardware cloth to remove the fibrous root debris from the phragmites removal, incorporated at 30% of the bed volume to provide the mineral density that the Louisiana alluvial soil carries. The result was a growing medium that had the fertility of the native Louisiana soil without its structural problems. Well-drained, aerated, moisture-retentive at root depth, but not waterlogged, with a pH adjusted to 6.4 with agricultural lime to address the natural acidity of the wetland-adjacent soil. 24 beds, each 4 feet wide, 30 feet long, running north-south to maximize sun exposure across the full length of each bed through the Louisiana growing season. The Louisiana growing calendar is not like any other state in the country. The subtropical climate means that the limiting factor is not cold. A light frost is the most that Terrebonne Parish typically experiences, and many winters pass without any frost at all. The limiting factor is heat. Summer in South Louisiana is so intensely hot and humid that many cool season crops simply cannot be grown from May through September. But the spring and fall seasons are extraordinarily long, and the mild winters allow production that would be impossible anywhere north of the Gulf Coast. I planted with the calendar that South Louisiana demands. Creole tomatoes went in first, the legendary variety that has been grown in Louisiana for generations, adapted to the heat and humidity of the Gulf Coast in ways that standard commercial varieties are not. Creole tomatoes have a flavor intensity that comes from the mineral-rich Louisiana alluvial soil and the particular combination of heat and humidity that would destroy most other tomato varieties. Okra, which thrives in exactly the hot, humid conditions that South Louisiana delivers, went along the southern edge of the production zone where the afternoon sun was most intense. Louisiana okra grows fast, produces abundantly, and in the raised bed-growing medium I had built, it grew to heights I hadn't anticipated. Sweet potatoes went into the largest beds. They love the warm Louisiana soil and produce abundantly in the long growing season. The Beauregard variety, developed at Louisiana State University specifically for the Gulf Coast climate, went in as slips in late spring and in the managed wetland area of the southwestern corner. The section I had chosen not to drain, but to manage. I planted Louisiana iris, native sedges, and along the edges, a crop I had not originally planned, but which made perfect sense once I understood the property. Crawfish. Louisiana red swamp crawfish, the species that has made South Louisiana famous, thrive in managed shallow water impoundments. The managed wetland area, with its controlled water levels, was a natural crawfish pond. I stocked it in the fall of the first year. Thibodaux, when I told him about the crawfish, was the first time I saw him genuinely surprised. "You putting crawfish in that swampy corner?" he said. "Yes, sir," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Well," he said, "that ain't crazy." Coming from Thibodaux, that was the highest possible praise. A farm in Terrebonne Parish has to be built for a climate that is simultaneously generous and punishing. The heat and humidity that make crops grow also rot untreated wood, rust unprotected metal, and breed the mold and mildew that attack anything not properly ventilated. And then there are the hurricanes. Every structure I built on this property was designed with the knowledge that a major hurricane was not a possibility, but an inevitability. South Louisiana gets hit. The question is not if, but when and how hard. Building to survive that reality meant anchored foundations, metal roofing rated for high winds, and the particular kind of structural humility that comes from knowing the storm will always be stronger than the building if the building isn't built right. The main barn went up on a concrete slab elevated 18 inches above the surrounding grade, high enough to remain above the temporary flooding that a storm surge or heavy rain event could bring to this elevation. Metal frame, metal siding, metal roof, rated for 130-mile-per-hour winds, the roof pitch steep enough to shed water fast and reduce wind loading. Ventilation designed into the eaves to prevent the heat buildup that damages equipment and produce in the Louisiana summer. The produce processing and cooling area connected to the barn's east end, a refrigerated space essential for the fast post-harvest cooling that extends shelf life in the Louisiana heat. Vegetables harvested in the morning and cooled immediately have a dramatically longer market life than produce held at ambient temperature. A traditional Louisiana raised storage structure, a grenier, the Cajun elevated storage building, went up near the crawfish pond to store equipment and supplies associated with the wetland management operation, built on cedar posts, elevated 4 feet above grade, covered porch on the south side. The same vernacular architecture that Cajun farmers have used for 2 centuries because it works in this climate. 6 months into the project, a hurricane came, not the worst case. A Category 2 that tracked slightly east of Terrebonne Parish. which meant we got the western eye wall rather than the most intense eastern quadrant. But it was real. Wind sustained at 90 miles per hour for 4 hours, 8 inches of rain in 12 hours. Storm surge that pushed water from the coastal marshes northward and raised the water table across the parish by 2 feet for 3 days. I rode it out in the barn, which held without drama, the metal frame and anchored roof doing exactly what they were designed to do. The noise was extraordinary. The rain on the metal roof was indistinguishable from continuous thunder. When it passed, I walked the property in the grey, post-storm morning. The drainage system had worked. The water control gate had been opened before the storm to drop the water table as low as possible, giving maximum capacity to absorb the storm rainfall. The lateral ditches had moved water to the main ditch. The main ditch had moved water out. The production beds, elevated 12 inches above grade, were above the temporary flooding that covered the lower field zones. The crawfish pond in the southwestern corner had been topped up by the storm. Water, a benefit, not a problem. The barn intact, the beds intact, the crops damaged but not destroyed. The okra had been stripped of its leaves by the wind. The tomatoes had lost some fruit. The sweet potatoes underground were entirely unaffected. Thibodaux came over the morning after the storm. He walked the property in silence, the way people walk after a storm to assess what happened. He looked at the drainage ditches, still moving water. He looked at the elevated beds above the flood. A line. He looked at the barn, standing clean and undamaged. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "Your drainage held." "Yes, sir," I said. "That's the thing that kills most operations here," he said. "Water with nowhere to go." "I gave it somewhere to go," I said. He nodded slowly. That nod meant something in Terrebonne Parish. The summer of year 2 nearly broke me, and it had nothing to do with storms. South Louisiana summer heat, sustained temperatures above 95 degrees. Fahrenheit with humidity that makes the air feel like warm, wet cloth is a different kind of challenge than cold or drought. The heat doesn't kill dramatically. It just wears everything down, slowly, relentlessly. The crops that are heat-tolerant still struggle at the extremes. The soil surface in the beds dried and crusted despite mulching. The irrigation system ran constantly and still couldn't keep up with the evaporative demand in the hottest weeks. And the insects came. The Louisiana stink. Bug population found my Creole tomatoes in July, and the damage was severe. I had beneficial insect habitat plantings in place. Marigolds, basil, and native Louisiana wildflowers along the bed edges. But in the first full summer, those populations hadn't fully established. The stink bugs arrived before the natural predator balance was in place. I lost most of the summer tomato crop. The okra held. Okra is nearly indestructible in Louisiana summer heat, and the raised bed growing medium gave it the drainage it needed to thrive even in the worst heat. The sweet potatoes held, underground, immune to the surface drama of the summer. The crawfish pond, managed for the cool season as crawfish prefer, was simply closed for the summer, water levels reduced, waiting for fall, but the tomatoes were gone. I sat on the barn porch one August evening with the heat still present at 9 o'clock and the sound of the frogs from the managed wetland all around, and I went through the numbers. What I'd invested, what I'd earned, what the gap was. It was a hard evening. What I always came back to, was the drainage system, still working, the beds, still built, the crawfish pond, still there, the soil biology still building season by season under the mulch and the heat, the sweet potatoes still growing underground. The infrastructure was intact. The season had been hard. Those were different things. I replanted fall tomatoes in September, the Creole variety which the Louisiana fall climate suits perfectly. Cooler nights, still warm days, the particular quality of autumn light in the Gulf South. They came in beautifully. I want to tell you specifically about the crawfish pond because it became something I hadn't fully anticipated. The farm's most talked about feature, the thing that made Terrebonne Parish people understand what I was building. Louisiana red swamp crawfish have been farmed in the coastal parishes for over a century. The traditional operation is simple in principle: a shallow impoundment, typically converted rice fields or naturally low areas, flooded in the fall, stocked with crawfish, and harvested through the spring. The crawfish feed on the decomposing vegetation in the impoundment and grow through the cool season, harvested by traps from a flat-bottomed boat. My managed wetland area, the southwestern corner I had chosen not to drain, was a natural crawfish impoundment, 22 feet above sea level at its center. Surrounded by the native Louisiana vegetation I had preserved and enhanced, fed by the farm's own drainage water, which carried organic material from the production beds. Controllable water levels through the same gate system that managed the rest of the farm's drainage. I stocked it in October of the first year with crawfish from a hatchery in St. Mary Parish. By March, I was harvesting. The yields were modest in the first year. The vegetation base in the impoundment was still establishing. In the second year, with the organic matter from decomposing native plants building up on the impoundment floor, the yields nearly doubled, and they were Louisiana crawfish, grown in Terrebonne Parish, from a piece of land that everyone had written off as useless swamp. The chef at a Huma restaurant who bought my first harvest called me 3 days after the delivery to tell me her customers had asked where the crawfish came from. When she said Terrebonne Parish, locally grown from a farm, they had asked if they could visit. Thibodaux came to the first harvest. He helped me pull traps. He'd done it hundreds of times in his life, with the practiced efficiency of someone who grew up doing this work. We worked the traps together in the early morning before the sun was fully up, moving through the impoundment in a flat-bottomed skiff, pulling and resetting, the live crawfish going into aerated coolers. When we were done, he sat at the stern of the skiff and looked at the managed wetland. Around him, the native vegetation, the controlled water level, the farm visible on the higher ground to the north, the barn and beds and structure of it. "You made this work," he said. Not a question, a statement. "It wanted to work," I said. "It just needed the right help." He was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather farmed crawfish in a piece like this," he said, "before all the ones around here got drained." He paused. "Thought that was all gone." It wasn't gone. It was waiting. By year 3, the 20 acres of swampy, useless Louisiana land had become something that people drove to see. The production beds, 24 raised cypress beds, were in their third season of building soil and building yield. The Creole tomatoes in the fall and spring seasons were going to 3 Huma restaurants and a farmer's market in Thibodaux. The okra was a consistent performer through the long Louisiana summer. The sweet potatoes, Beauregard variety, Louisiana bred, had become the farm's signature crop, their orange flesh and sweet flavor, exactly what the Gulf Coast market wanted. The crawfish pond was producing at commercial scale in its third year. A local distributor was buying the entire harvest. The wetland management that made the crawfish operation possible was simultaneously filtering the farm's drainage water, providing habitat for the migratory birds that moved through the Terrebonne Parish coastal corridor in spring and fall, and demonstrating something that the conservation community in Louisiana had been arguing for years, that managed wetlands and productive agriculture are not opposites. They can be the same thing. The drainage system, Marcus's design, properly executed, had handled 3 hurricane seasons without failure. The barn had ridden out 2 more significant storms after that first one. The elevated beds had stayed above flood level through every rain event. The invasive species, the phragmites, the Chinese tallow trees, had been reduced to a maintenance-level management challenge. The native Louisiana plant communities that had been suppressed by the invasion were re-establishing along the managed wetland margins. Species I hadn't planted. Life finding its way back to a place that was becoming worth finding. Thibodaux brought his grandchildren to the farm in the spring of year 3. 3 kids, the youngest maybe 6 years old. He walked them through the beds, showing them the Creole tomato plants. He took them to the crawfish pond and helped the youngest one hold a live crawfish for the first time. At the end of the visit, he stood at the barn porch and looked at the full property, the beds, the managed wetland, the barn, the drainage system visible in the ditch lines, the native vegetation re-establishing along the margins. "When I was young," he said, "this whole parish looked more like this, before everything got drained and sprayed." He paused. "Good to see it again. Let me tell you what useless land becomes when you stop arguing with it and start listening to it. It becomes a crawfish operation that a Houma restaurant chef calls to ask if her customers can visit. It becomes Creole tomatoes grown in raised beds above the Louisiana floodline, going to farmers markets and restaurants that want to say local on their menus. It becomes a managed wetland that filters water, provides habitat, and produces food from a corner of the property that everyone told me to drain and forget. It becomes a place where Thibodaux's grandchildren hold a live crawfish for the first time, on land that Thibodaux's generation had given up on. This land was never useless. It was misunderstood. It was approached with the wrong tools, the wrong expectations, the wrong relationship. It wanted drainage, not fighting. It wanted elevated beds, not tillage. It wanted its wet corner managed as a wetland, not forced into being something it wasn't. When I gave it what it actually needed, when I stopped trying to make it into dry upland farm and let it be what it was, managed and productive on its own terms, it became more than I had planned. 20 acres of swampy, boot-swallowing, mosquito-growing, previously useless Louisiana land. Now it's a thriving farm. And Thibodaux doesn't shake his head anymore when he drives past. He waves.